The clock on the studio wall ticked past midnight. Harper King adjusted her headphones, the faint hiss of the open microphone a familiar comfort.
You're listening to the midnight hour, the time for confessions, for fears, for the stories that haunt the edges of the night.
Harper thrived in the solitude of the late-night hours. Her small studio, bathed in the warm glow of a vintage lamp, became her sanctuary. The listeners, scattered across the city, were her companions. Insomniacs, truck drivers, students burning the midnight oil. They were her community, bound by the shared intimacy of the radio waves. She'd heard it all: tales of lost loves, strange encounters, the occasional prank call. Tonight, however, the air held a different kind of stillness. The red light on the phone console blinked, signaling a caller. Harper smiled, anticipating the usual array of stories.
You're on the air.
Her voice betrayed no hint of the unease that had begun to prickle at the back of her neck.
Help me.
A voice, raspy and thin as old paper, whispered through the speakers. The sound was faint, almost lost in the static, but the raw terror bleeding through the line was unmistakable. Harper's smile faltered. This was no ordinary call.
Hello, can you hear me? Who is this?
The only response was a choked sob, followed by a string of frantic whispers, too garbled to decipher. Then silence. Harper tapped her fingers on the console, her mind racing. Prank calls were common enough, but this felt different. The desperation in that voice, the sheer terror, it felt real. Too real.
I'm gonna try to clean up that line.
Harper told her listeners, her voice betraying a hint of the chill that now ran down her spine. She worked the controls, trying to boost the signal, but the static only intensified. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the voice was gone. The phone line went dead. Harper stared at the blinking light, a sense of unease settling in the pit of her stomach. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the late hour and her active imagination. After all, this was radio, a breeding ground for tall tales and overactive imaginations. But the feeling persisted. The studio, usually a haven, suddenly felt cold, the air thick with an unseen tension. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, twisting into menacing shapes in her peripheral vision. Harper took a deep breath, willing herself to relax. It was just a prank call, she told herself. Nothing to worry about. The following night, Harper couldn't shake the memory of the previous night's call. The desperation in that voice lingered, a haunting echo in the quiet studio. She tried to focus on her work, on the usual stream of callers sharing their tales, but the memory of that whispered plea for help clung to her like a shroud. Then it happened again. The red light on the console blinked, and Harper's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the button. Part of her, a small cowardly part, wanted to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't seen the light. But the journalist in her, the part that craved a good story, couldn't resist. With a deep breath, she answered.
Help me.
The voice, the same voice, rasped through the speakers. This time it was clearer, stronger, but no less terrifying.
They're here, in the walls, whispering.
The words sent a shiver down Harper's spine. She tried to question the caller to get more information, but the voice was already fading, dissolving into a chorus of whispers and static. Then, silence. Again, Harper tried to trace the call, but the phone lines led nowhere. The calls were impossible, originating from disconnected numbers, deadlines. The impossible nature of the calls only served to deepen the mystery, drawing Harper further into the chilling narrative. Over the next few nights, the calls became a nightly ritual. Each night, the same voice, the same pleas for help, the same chilling whispers. Each call originated from a different impossible location, each ending abruptly, swallowed by the static. Harper's initial fear gave way to a grim determination. She had to find out who was behind the calls, had to understand the story behind the terror. She began researching old cases, unsolved mysteries, anything that might provide a clue. She contacted other radio stations, other late-night hosts, seeking any similar experiences. But her efforts were met with dead ends. The calls, it seemed, were hers alone to bear. The lack of answers only fueled Harper's obsession. The calls had become an itch she couldn't scratch, a puzzle she couldn't solve. She found herself listening to hours of static, hoping for a stray word, a clue, anything that might lead her to the truth. The mystery had become an anchor, dragging her deeper into its depths. As the calls continued, the studio, once her sanctuary, began to feel different. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, moving just as she turned her head. The equipment, usually reliable, started acting up. Microphones crackled with unexplained static, lights flickered, and the air grew noticeably colder. One night, during a commercial break, Harper swore she saw a figure standing in the darkened production booth. It was just a fleeting glimpse, a tall, shadowy figure, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through her. She spun around, heart pounding, but the booth was empty. The whispers started subtly. At first, Harper dismissed them as the product of her sleep-deprived state. But as the days turned into nights, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the very equipment she used every night. They spoke of fear, of entrapment, of a darkness that threatened to consume all those who dared to listen. Desperate for answers, Harper reached out to a former colleague, a seasoned radio veteran named Arthur, who had hosted a similar late-night show years ago. Arthur, now retired and living a quiet life in the suburbs, was initially reluctant to discuss his past, but Harper's persistence and the genuine fear in her voice convinced him to talk.
There are some stories, Arthur said, his voice raspy with age, some voices, that are best left undisturbed.
He told her about a series of calls he had received years ago, calls that mirrored Harper's own experiences. The voice, the terror, the whispers. It was all too familiar. Arthur had never discovered the identity of the caller, but he had come to believe that the calls were more than just pranks, more than just the ramblings of a disturbed mind. He believed that the calls were a gateway, a conduit to something dark and ancient.
The calls, Arthur warned, his voice barely a whisper. They have a way of pulling you in, of making you a part of the story.
His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Harper realized with a sickening certainty that Arthur wasn't just telling her a story, he was issuing a warning. Harper returned to the studio that night, her mind awash in fear and a strange sense of morbid curiosity. As she sat down at the console, the red light blinked, signaling a caller. She knew with a chilling certainty who it was.
"You're on the air," she said, her voice trembling slightly.
It's too late. The voice rasped, closer now, as if the caller were standing right beside her. You're one of us now.
The whispers started, louder than ever, swirling around her, suffocating her. Harper's hand trembled as she reached for the console, trying to shut off the microphone, but her fingers wouldn't obey. She was trapped, caught in the web of the calls, just as Arthur had warned. The studio door creaked open and a figure stepped inside. It was a young woman, her eyes wide with nervous excitement. She was the new intern, eager to learn the ropes of late-night radio.
Is it time for my shift? She asked, her voice bright and cheerful, oblivious to the terror that had gripped the studio.
Harper's voice caught in her throat. She wanted to scream a warning, to tell the young woman to run, but the words wouldn't come. The whispers intensified, drowning out all other sounds. The intern sat down at the console, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the microphone. She adjusted her headphones, smiling.
You're listening to the Midnight Hour, she announced, her voice confident and clear. What stories will you tell tonight?
The red light on the console blinked, signaling a caller.